Not my blood, he said, sealing my fate in a room smelling of oak and expensive cologne. The two legitimate heirs smiled like they had won a game I was never dealt into, but then the estate lawyer froze, his hand resting on a thick, different-colored file. He looked up and changed the room's temperature with a single sentence. "Mr. Kincaid, I must interrupt. There is another document, and it does not belong to you." My name is Avery Lewis, and I was 35 years old when I walked into the conference room at Hart and Weller Fiduciary Services in Providence, Rhode Island. The air inside the building was recycled and chilled to a temperature that felt designed to preserve old money and freeze out anyone who did not belong. I checked my watch. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I had taken a half-day off from my job at Mariner Risk Analytics, a decision that cost me 4 hours of paid time off, just to come here and be told what I already knew. I was the outsider. I always had been. The conference room was a cavern of mahogany and floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the gray waters of the river. My stepfather, Douglas Kincaid, was already seated at the head of the table. To his right sat his biological children, Sloane and Ryan. They looked like a matched set of porcelain dolls, expensive and fragile, though I knew Sloane possessed the internal fragility of a bear trap. She was scrolling through her phone, the light reflecting off her manicured nails. Ryan stared at the grain of the wood on the table, his shoulders hunched in that permanent posture of avoidance he had perfected since high school. Douglas did not look up when I entered. He was busy arranging a stack of documents, aligning the edges with a precision that bordered on obsessive. "Sit down, Avery," he said, his voice flat. "We are on a schedule." I took the seat furthest from them, the one closest to the door. It was a habit I had developed over 2 decades of living in the Kincaid household. Always keep an exit strategy. Mason Hart, the estate lawyer, sat opposite Douglas. He was a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than my car. He nodded to me, a brief, professional acknowledgement that felt like an apology in advance. Douglas cleared his throat. It was a sound that used to make the temperature in our dining room drop 10 degrees. He placed his hand on the leather binder in front of him. "Let us make this simple," Douglas began, looking directly at Mason, ignoring me completely. "My wife, Claire, passed away 6 months ago. We have grieved. Now we must organize the future. As the head of this family and the executor of the primary estate, I have outlined the distribution of assets." He pushed the binder toward Mason. "Everything is in order. The house in Newport, the investment portfolio, the liquid cash accounts, it all goes to the Kincaid lineage. My real children will inherit everything." There it was, the phrase he had been waiting to say out loud since the day he married my mother. My real children. He said it with a finality that sucked the oxygen out of the room. It was not just a statement of inheritance, it was a retroactive erasure of my existence in his life. Sloane let out a small, sharp laugh, like a bird chirping. She finally looked up from her phone, her eyes bright with victory. She did not look at me with hatred. It was worse than that. She looked at me with pity. Ryan shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He kept his eyes down, studying his hands. His silence was a loud endorsement. In the Kincaid house, silence was how you survived, and Ryan was a survivor. Douglas turned his gaze to me for the first time. "Avery," he said, his tone dropping to that faux sympathetic register he used when he wanted to sound benevolent in front of strangers. "You understand. Of course, you are not my blood. You are the child of another man. Your mother brought you into this marriage, and I supported you. I put a roof over your head. I fed you. That was my charity. But my legacy belongs to Sloane and Ryan." I kept my face perfectly still. I had practiced this expression in the mirror for 3 days. No tears, no anger, just a blank slate. "I understand. Douglas," I said. My voice was steady. "Good," he said, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. He turned back to Mason. "So, draw up the final transfer papers. We are done here." The room fell silent. Sloane smirked, already mentally spending the money. Douglas leaned back, the king of his small, petty kingdom. Then, the rhythm of the room broke. Mason Hart did not reach for the binder Douglas had pushed toward him. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his hands clasped on the table. He looked at Douglas, then at Sloane, and finally, his gaze rested on me for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary. "Mr. Kincaid," Mason said. His voice was soft, but it carried a weight that cut through Douglas's arrogance like a diamond cutter through glass. What Douglas snapped. "Is there a problem with the paperwork I'm afraid I must interrupt?" Mason said. He reached down into his briefcase, which had been sitting on the floor by his feet. He pulled out a file. It was not the standard manila folder or the black leather binders Douglas favored. It was a thick, navy blue dossier, bound with a red string. The paper looked dense, heavy with age and importance. Mason placed the blue file on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood was heavy, a dull thud that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. "There is another document," Mason said, "and it does not belong to you." Douglas frowned, a crease appearing between his eyebrows. "What are you talking about? I know every asset Claire had. She had a checking account with $4,000 in it and her personal jewelry." "That is it." Mason shook his head slowly. "That is incorrect. Mr. Kincaid, you are aware of the assets your wife shared with you. You are not aware of the Whitmore Lineage Trust." Douglas laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Trust Claire came from nothing. Her parents were teachers. There is no trust. This trust was established in 1998, prior to your marriage." Mason continued, his voice devoid of emotion. He opened the blue file. "It is a blind administration trust, established by your late wife's maternal grandfather, utilizing funds from a patent sale that occurred 3 decades ago. The terms of the trust were strict. The beneficiary was to have no control until the death of the primary grantor, or in this case, upon the death of Claire Whitmore. Furthermore, the existence of the trust was to remain confidential from any spouse to ensure the assets remained within the bloodline." Sloane's smile had vanished. She was sitting up straight now, her eyes darting between her father and the lawyer. Ryan had stopped looking at his hands and was staring at the blue file. Douglas's face turned a mottled shade of red. "This is ridiculous. If Claire had money, I would have known. I managed our finances. I paid the bills. You managed the finances she allowed you to see." Mason corrected him. He flipped a page in the file. "The current valuation of the Whitmore Lineage Trust, including accrued interest, real estate holdings in Boston and Providence, and a diversified market portfolio, is not a negligible amount." "How much?" Sloane demanded. Her voice was shrill. "Is it 100,000? 200? Mason looked at her over the rim of his reading glasses. "As of the closing of the markets yesterday, the total asset value stands at $32,450,000. The number hung in the air. 32 million. I heard a sharp intake of breath. It might have been mine. It definitely wasn't Douglas. He looked like he had been struck in the chest with a sledgehammer. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "That is impossible," Douglas whispered. 30 million. She wore clothes from discount racks. She drove a 6-year-old sedan. That was her choice, Mason said. But there is more. The trust also holds the controlling interest in a limited liability company called Archer Holdings. Douglas went pale. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like a magic trick. Archer Holdings. Douglas choked out the words. Archer Holdings owns the lease on my distribution warehouse. They own the land my main factory sits on. Correct, Mason said. You have been paying rent to Archer Holdings for 15 years. Assuming it was a faceless conglomerate, you were paying the trust. So, Douglas stammered, his hands shaking as he reached for the file. So, as her husband, I control this now. I am the executor. Mason placed his hand firmly on top of the blue file. No, Mr. Kincaid, you do not. The trust is explicit. It falls outside the marital estate. It is not subject to your will, your oversight, or your control. Douglas looked at the lawyer, then at his children, and finally, with a dawning horror. He looked at me. Mason turned his body toward me. He picked up a heavy fountain pen from his pocket. He unscrewed the cap. The sound was small, precise, and devastatingly loud in the silent room. The sole beneficiary of the Whitmore Lineage Trust, including the $32 million and the controlling stake in Archer Holdings, is the only direct descendant listed in the document. Mason looked at me. His eyes were kind, but his jaw was set like granite. It is Avery Lewis. Mason placed the pen on the table in front of me. He did not toss it. He set it down with reverence, the way a king might bestow a sword, or a jailer might hand over a key to a prisoner who had served their time. "Sign here, Ms. Lewis," Mason said, "and the transfer is complete." The ink was wet on the page, a deep, glossy black that seemed to absorb the fluorescent light of the conference room. I capped the pen. My hand was steady, which was a surprise. I expected tremors. I expected the adrenaline to make me shake, but instead, a strange, cold calm had settled over me. It was the same professional detachment I wore every day at Mariner Risk Analytics. I worked in compliance and risk assessment. My job was to look at spreadsheets, corporate structures, and operational workflows to find the hairline fractures that everyone else ignored. I spent 40 hours a week scanning for the things that could bring a company down: the overlooked regulation, the disgruntled employee, the unsecured server. It was a career built on paranoia and precision. I lived in a second-floor walk-up in East Providence that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage from the neighbor downstairs. I drove a sedan with 112,000 miles on the odometer. I paid my own student loans, my own car insurance, and my own dental bills. I had built a life on the premise that no one was coming to save me. That was the lesson Douglas Kincaid had taught me, though he never wrote it on a blackboard. Douglas was not a violent man. He did not throw plates or raise his fist. Violence would have been too messy, too emotional for him. Douglas dealt in exclusion. He weaponized bureaucracy within our own home. From the time I was 12, I understood that there were two tiers of citizenship in the Kincaid household. Sloan and Ryan were citizens. I was a resident alien, tolerated but subject to deportation at any moment. I remembered a summer when I was 16. Sloan wanted to go to a tennis camp in Florida. Douglas wrote the check without looking up from his newspaper. 2 days later, I asked for $150 to go on a biology field trip. Douglas had put down his coffee, taken off his reading glasses, and looked at me with that mild, disappointed expression he had perfected. He asked me to present a budget. He asked me to explain why this investment was necessary for my future solvency. He made me stand there for 20 minutes, justifying my existence, only to tell me that the household budget for discretionary spending had been allocated to Sloane's tennis. It was not about the money, it was about the hierarchy. Sloane grew up breathing that air of superiority. She did not just think she was better than me, she knew it as a fact of nature. Like gravity, she was the sun, and I was just some debris caught in the orbit. Ryan was different. He was the Switzerland of our family. He hated conflict. If Douglas was freezing me out at the dinner table, Ryan would stare at his peas, terrified that if he spoke, the eye of Sauron would turn toward him. He survived by making himself small, by never having an opinion, by never taking a side. I did not hate him for it, but I did not trust him either. Neutrality in the face of injustice is just a polite form of cowardice. My mother, Claire, had been the only buffer. She was soft where Douglas was hard, quiet where he was loud. But looking back, I realized her quietness was not submission, it was camouflage. She had died 6 months ago after a 2-year battle with ovarian cancer. Those 2 years were a blur of chemotherapy appointments, quiet sobbing in bathrooms, and the slow, agonizing erosion of a vibrant woman. But even as she faded, there was something sharp in her eyes. I always thought she was trapped. I thought she stayed with Douglas because she had no skills, no money, and nowhere to go. She was a teacher who had stopped working when she married him. I used to look at her and wonder how she could stand it, the way he cut her off in conversation, the way he managed the household allowance like a prison warden. But there were cracks in that narrative, little glitches in the matrix that I had filed away without analyzing. I remembered when I was 22 and my car transmission blew out on the highway. I was fresh out of college. working an unpaid internship, and I had exactly $40 in my bank account. The repair bill was $1,800. I called my mother, crying, terrified I would lose the internship if I could not get to work. Douglas was on a business trip. I expected her to say we had to wait for him to come back, that she would have to ask him. Instead, she showed up at the mechanic's shop an hour later. She did not use a credit card. She opened her purse and counted out $1,800 in crisp, $100 bills. She told me not to mention it to Douglas. She said she had saved it from the grocery money. I believed her then. I wanted to believe her. But you do not save $1,800 from grocery money. When Douglas audited the receipts every Sunday night, there were other times. The time our landlord threatened to evict me because of a roommate issue, and suddenly the problem just went away. The time I needed emergency dental surgery, and the clinic said it had been paid in full by an anonymous donor. I had assumed it was luck. I had assumed the universe was throwing me a bone because it knew how hard I was trying. I was an idiot. It was not the universe. It was Claire Whitmore, the biggest clue. The one that should have screamed the truth to me. Came 3 days before she died. I was sitting by her bedside in hospice. The room was dim, lit only by the machines monitoring her failing vitals. Douglas had gone home to shower, or more likely, to check his stock portfolio. It was just us. Her hand was cold in mine, her skin like paper. She squeezed my fingers with surprising strength. She pulled me closer. Her voice was a rasp, wrecked by the medication and the exhaustion of dying. "Avery," she whispered, "listen to me. I am here." "Mom," I said, "there will be a meeting," she said. Her eyes were wide, focused on something I could not see. "After I am gone, at the lawyer's office," I nodded, thinking she was delirious. "Douglas will talk," she wheezed. "He will talk about the house. He will talk about the money. He will say things that hurt. He will say, 'You get nothing.'" "I know." "Mom," I said, tears running down my face. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," she hissed. She gripped my hand harder. "When he talks, you do nothing. You sit there. You let him say every word. You do not cry. You do not scream. And if a man reads papers in front of you, do not speak until the lawyer finishes. Do you hear me? Wait until the lawyer is done." I thought it was the morphine talking. I thought she was just worried I would get into a fight with Douglas and get cut off from whatever crumbs he might toss my way. I promised her just to make her peaceful. I smoothed her hair and told her I would be good. Now, sitting in this air-conditioned boardroom with a $32 million trust fund in my name, the memory hit me like a physical blow. She knew. She knew exactly what Douglas would do. She knew he would gather us here, humiliate me, and declare his biological supremacy. She had choreographed this moment from her deathbed. She had let him dig his own grave, shovel by shovel, word by word, just so the lawyer could kick him into it. I looked at the blue file under my hand. I looked at Mason Hart, who was watching me with a mixture of professional patience and hidden amusement. Then I looked at Douglas. He was slumped in his chair, staring at the wall as if trying to calculate how this had happened. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The tyrant had lost his castle in the blink of an eye, but the question gnawed at me. It clawed at the back of my throat, bitter and sharp. If she had this much money, if she had $30 million in property and power, why did she stay? Why did she let him treat her like an employee? Why did she let him treat me like a nuisance? She could have left him a decade ago. She could have bought a penthouse in Boston and taken me with her. We could have had a life free of his cold, suffocating control. Why did she live a lie for 20 years? Mason cleared his throat, bringing me back to the room. "There is one more thing. Ms. Lewis," he said. I looked up. "This trust structure is complex," he said. "It was designed to remain dormant until a specific trigger event, but your mother left a personal letter for you. It is sealed." He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. It was thick, sealed with wax. "She left instructions that you were only to receive this if Douglas made the declaration regarding his biological children," Mason said, "if he had divided the estate equally. This letter was to be destroyed." He slid the envelope across the polished mahogany. It stopped inches from my hand. I picked it up. My name was written on the front in her handwriting, elegant, looped, and familiar. Sloane was staring at the envelope as if it were a bomb. In a way, it was. I did not open it. Not yet. I had learned my lesson about patience. I put the envelope in my bag and stood up. "Thank you. Mr. Hart," I said. Douglas looked up at me. His eyes were wide, panic starting to replace the shock. "Avery," he said, "we need to talk. We need to discuss how to manage this. You don't know anything about finance." I looked at him. I really looked at him. For the first time in my life, I did not see a father figure or an authority. I saw a man who was terrified of losing control. "I think I will figure it out." "Douglas," I said. I walked out of the room. I did not look back at Sloane or Ryan. I walked out of the building, into the cool Rhode Island afternoon. The wind off the river was brisk. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that finally, for the first time in 35 years, felt like it belonged to me. But the envelope in my bag felt heavy. It pulsed with the weight of unanswered questions. Why stay? Why suffer? I had the money. Now I needed the truth. The adrenaline that had propelled me out of the conference room began to fade, replaced by a cold, analytical need for details. I followed Mason Hart into his private office, a smaller, quieter space lined with books that looked like they had been read rather than just displayed. I sat in a leather chair that felt too large for me, clutching the blue file as if it were a life preserver. Mason sat opposite me and opened a second, thinner file. He did not treat me like a lottery winner. He treated me like a client who had just inherited a complex liability. "We need to go through the structure." "Avery," Mason said, his voice dropping the theatrical tone he had used in the boardroom. What happened in there was the theater. "This is the mechanics." He spread a series of diagrams across the desk. They looked like the corporate flowcharts I analyzed every day at Mariner Risk Analytics. But the entity names were unfamiliar. "Your mother did not just hide money under a mattress," Mason began. "This is a blind administration trust. It was established by your grandfather, Samuel Whitmore, in 1998. He was a man who did not trust easy money, and he certainly did not trust the man his daughter was about to marry." I looked at the date on the document. It was 3 months before my mother married Douglas. "The structure is specific," Mason explained, tracing a line on the chart with his finger. "It effectively stripped Claire of any legal control over the principal assets while she was alive. She could not withdraw the capital. She could not leverage it for loans, because she had no control. She could legally swear on financial affidavits that she had no access to these funds. That is how she survived 20 years of Douglas's audits. She did not lie. Avery, she relied on a technicality." I stared at the paperwork. It was brilliant. It was a cage that protected the bird inside, but the assets grew. I said, looking at the valuation summary. How Mason nodded. "Your grandfather seeded it with patent royalties, but your mother had the right to appoint an investment advisor. She chose this firm. We invested aggressively in sectors Douglas ignored. Tech in the early 2000s, biotech, real estate and gentrifying neighborhoods." He turned a page to show a list of holdings. "We own 3 apartment complexes in Boston, a commercial strip in Providence, and a significant portfolio of blue-chip stocks. But there is one asset you need to understand immediately because it is the one that will make Douglas dangerous." Mason tapped a line item highlighted in yellow Archer Holdings. LLC, Archer Holdings. I read aloud. "I have seen this name on the return address of bills at the house. You have," Mason said. "Archer Holdings is a limited liability company wholly owned by the trust. It specializes in commercial industrial leasing. Specifically, it owns the land and the building at 44 Industrial Way." My stomach dropped. "That is Douglas's main distribution center." "Correct," Mason said, a small, grim smile touching his lips. "For 15 years, Douglas Kincaid has been negotiating leases with what he thought was a faceless property management firm. He has been paying rent to his wife's trust. Every time he boasted about squeezing his landlord for a better rate, he was negotiating with us, and every check he wrote went right back into the pot that now belongs to you." I sat back, stunned. The irony was suffocating. Douglas, who prided himself on being the master of his domain, had been a tenant in his own kingdom. But why, I asked, the question feeling inadequate. Why live like that? I thought of my mother's kitchen. The linoleum floor was peeling in the corners. She used the same winter coat for 8 years. When we went on vacation, it was always to places Douglas chose, where he paid for everything and made sure we knew the cost of every shrimp cocktail. She never bought herself jewelry. She never upgraded her car. She lived with a frugality that bordered on penance. Mason pulled out a ledger. It was an accounting of income distributions. She did not spend the money on herself. Avery, she spent it on the one thing Douglas refused to fund. He pushed the ledger toward me. I looked at the columns. The dates stretched back 15 years. The payees were not retail stores or travel agencies. July 2008, $5,000. Payee Rhode Island Arts Camp. September 2012, $12,000. Payee University Housing Services. March 2015, $1,800. Payee Auto Repair Solutions. I stopped at that one. The transmission. The time she showed up with cash. She laundered the money to me. I whispered. Mason nodded. We had to be creative. If she handed you cash, Douglas would notice. So we set up third-party payment structures. Remember the Pell Grant you thought you qualified for in your sophomore year? Even though your household income was too high. I nodded slowly. I had always wondered about that. The financial aid office said there had been an external adjustment. That was the trust. Mason said, we created a private scholarship fund. The emergency loan you got when you moved into your first apartment? That was the trust. The anonymous donor who covered your dental surgery. The trust. I felt tears pricking my eyes. But I refused to let them fall. I was an auditor. I looked at the data. She created a shadow economy. I said, my voice shaking. She built a financial ecosystem just to keep me alive without alerting him. She wanted you to be independent, Mason said softly, but she also knew that if Douglas found out she had resources, he would either guilt her into giving them to him for his businesses, or he would make her life a living hell to get at them. So she played the role of the poor, dependent wife. She bought her freedom on the installment plan. And the beneficiary was you. I looked at the total at the bottom of the distribution column. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars, dripped out over decades in amounts small enough to avoid detection. Mason closed the ledger. Now you understand the stakes, he said, his voice hardening. This is not just about inheritance. This is about humiliation. Douglas Kincaid has just been exposed as a fool in front of his own lawyers. He has lost control of his business's real estate, and his biological children have been bypassed for the stepdaughter he treated like furniture. He leaned forward. Sloan will not accept this. She will claim undue influence. She will claim the trust was mismanaged. Douglas will try to find a loophole to break the blind administration clause. They will attack you, Avery. They will attack your character, your competence, and your mother's memory. I straightened my spine. Let them try. Mason reached into his desk drawer. There is one final document, he said. He pulled out the heavy cream-colored envelope that he had slid across the boardroom table earlier. He placed it between us. I told you inside that this letter was conditional. Mason said, your mother was very specific. If Douglas had treated you fairly today, if he had given you even a fraction of the estate, this letter was to be burned. He tapped the wax seal. But she knew him. Mason said, she knew the man he was behind closed doors. She predicted he would use the phrase real children. She predicted he would try to cut you out entirely. And because he did exactly what she feared, this letter is now yours. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the rough paper. It contains more than just sentiment. Avery, Mason warned, it contains instructions. It contains the location of the bodies, metaphorically speaking, and it is the nuclear option. I looked at the envelope. It was not just a letter. It was a weapon. My mother had spent 20 years forging it in the fires of her own silence, and now she had placed the hilt in my hand. I picked it up. I am ready to read it. I said. Mason nodded and stood up. gesturing to the door. "Take it home," he said. "Read it where you are safe. And tomorrow, bring your armor. The war has just begun." I sat at the scratched laminate table in my small kitchen, the silence of my apartment amplifying the sound of the envelope tearing open. Outside, the noise of East Providence traffic hummed a stark contrast to the hushed, air-conditioned atmosphere of the law firm I had just left. I poured myself a glass of tap water, my hand trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what I was holding. I pulled the letter out. It was 3 pages long, handwritten on heavy, cream-colored stationery that I recognized. My mother had bought a box of this paper 10 years ago at a discount store, claiming she wanted to write thank you notes. I never saw her send one. She had been saving it for this. "My dearest Avery," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means Douglas has done exactly what I knew he would do. It means he has looked at you, the child I raised and loved more than life itself, and decided you are not worth his legacy. I am sorry you had to sit in that room and hear those words, but I need you to understand why I let it happen. I need you to understand the 2 lives I have lived." I read on, my chest tightening, to the world and to Douglas. I was Claire, the quiet wife. I was the woman who clipped coupons, who wore the same winter coat until the lining shredded, and who asked for permission to buy a new toaster. That was the role I had to play. It was a costume. Avery, every time I nodded and looked at the floor when he lectured me about household expenses, I was buying time. But there was another Claire. This is the part I could never tell you. I was not just the beneficiary of a blind trust. I was its architect. Mason Hart and I had a system. Every Tuesday afternoon, when I told Douglas I was volunteering at the library, I was meeting a courier in the back of the reading room to sign investment authorizations. I did not just let the money sit there. Avery, I made it work. When Douglas said the internet was a fad in the late 90s, I authorized Mason to buy heavily into tech stocks. When Douglas said real estate in the warehouse district was dead money, I instructed the trust to buy the land under his own feet. I lived a life of poverty in his house so that I could build an empire in the shadows. I lowered the letter, staring at the peeling paint on my kitchen wall. My mother, who I thought was passive, who I thought was beaten down by life, had been betting against her husband's business instincts for 2 decades and winning. The next paragraph answered the question that had haunted me my entire adult life. "You must have wondered why I never helped you more, why I let you take out student loans, why I let you drive that terrible car. It broke my heart every single day. But I knew Douglas. If I had given you money, real money, he would have seen it. He tracks every penny in our orbit. If you had sudden cash, he would have either claimed credit for it, demanded you invest it in his failing schemes, or used it as a lever to control you. I had to let you struggle so that you would be invisible to him. I had to let you become strong on your own terms so that when this money finally dropped into your lap, you would know how to protect it. You are not a princess receiving a gift. Avery, you are a warrior receiving your sword." I wiped a tear from my cheek. It was a brutal kind of love, a strategic affection that prioritized my long-term survival over my short-term comfort. She had watched me scrape by, knowing she could fix it with a signature, but holding back to ensure the weapon remained concealed until she was gone. The letter continued, her handwriting becoming slightly more jagged, as if she were writing in a hurry. "You are asking why I stayed, why I didn't take you and leave 10 years ago. It wasn't weakness, it was math. If I had filed for divorce, Douglas would have dragged us into a legal war that would have lasted until the trust was drained. He would have used discovery to find this money. He would have fought for half of it, not because he needed it, but because he could not stand to lose. I stayed to protect the asset. I gave up my happiness to ensure your freedom." I took a deep breath. She had martyred herself for a balance sheet. It sounded cold, but in the context of the Kincaid family, it was the ultimate act of defiance. But there is one more thing. The letter concluded, "Douglas walks through the world like a giant, but he is a man built on fear. You will find out why he is always afraid of something he does not name. He is terrified of debt. Avery." Not the kind you pay to a bank, but the kind you owe to a person who knows the truth. Check the yellow envelope Mason included. I made him sign it in 2010. Use it, love, Mom. I set the letter down and reached into my bag for the second. Smaller envelope I had received from Mason. It was sealed with a simple piece of tape. I ripped it open. Inside was a single legal document, dated October 14th, 2010. It was a promissory note. I scanned the legalese, my eyes widening as I understood what I was looking at. In the year 2010, Douglas's main manufacturing company had faced a liquidity crisis. I remembered that year. The tension in the house had been unbearable. He had fired the housekeeper. We ate pasta for months. He had told everyone it was a market correction, but this document told a different story. It was a personal loan agreement. Douglas Kincaid, the borrower, acknowledged a debt of $1.5 million to the Whitmore Lineage Trust. The lender, he had borrowed money from my mother's trust to save his company. But it wasn't just a loan. I read the terms. It was a demand note. That meant the lender could call for full repayment at any time, without prior notice. And then I saw the kicker. A clause that made my breath catch in my throat. To secure this loan, the borrower pledges his personal voting shares in Kincaid Industries as collateral. I sat back, the paper trembling in my hands. Douglas didn't just owe the trust money. He had pawned his control of his own company to my mother to save his skin. He had signed this thinking he was borrowing from a faceless entity. Or perhaps he knew Mason had said the trust was blind. But maybe Douglas had been desperate enough to sign anything Mason put in front of him, assuming his wife would never have the power to enforce it. He had signed it because he thought Claire was weak. He thought she would never call the debt. He thought she was just the woman who clipped coupons. But Claire wasn't the lender anymore. I looked at the date again. The statute of limitations on a demand note in Rhode Island was 20 years. The note was valid. I realized then that Mason was right. This wasn't just an inheritance. My mother hadn't just left me wealth. She had left me the trigger to a trap she had set 15 years ago. She had saved him from bankruptcy only to put a leash around his neck. And then she had handed the other end of the leash to me from beyond the grave. I traced my finger over Douglas's signature at the bottom of the page. It was bold, arrogant, taking up twice as much space as necessary. He had announced to a room full of people that I was not his child. He had tried to erase me. I picked up my phone and looked at the screen. I had 3 missed calls from Sloan and a text from Ryan asking if I was okay. I ignored them. I looked around my small kitchen. It didn't look like a prison anymore. It looked like a command center. My mother had played a long, quiet game of chess while Douglas was playing checkers. She had sacrificed her queen to set up the checkmate. I folded the promissory note and placed it back in the envelope, sliding it right next to the letter. I wasn't just an heir, I was a creditor, and Douglas Kincaid was about to find out that his debt was past due. Peace lasted exactly 48 hours. I had spent 2 days feeling the strange, intoxicating weight of the promissory note in my bag, sleeping with it on my nightstand like a loaded gun. I thought I had the upper hand. I thought the silence from the Kincaid estate meant they were retreating to lick their wounds. I was naive. They weren't retreating. They were reloading. The first shot was fired on a Thursday morning, not in a courtroom, but on the digital battlefield. I woke up to a notification from a local business blog that covered the Rhode Island socialite scene. The headline was vague but damaging inheritance. Dispute raises questions of elder abuse in prominent Providence family. They didn't name me directly, but the description was surgical. They spoke of a unbiological relative who had isolated a dying woman and manipulated financial instruments during her final medicated days. It was Sloan. I could hear her voice in the syntax. She had hired a crisis management firm before she even hired a litigator. She was painting a picture of me as a predator before I even had a chance to speak. By the time I got to my desk at Mariner Risk Analytics, the atmosphere had shifted. Usually, my morning involved a quiet coffee and a review of the overnight compliance logs. Today, my keycard worked, but the receptionist didn't make eye contact. At 10 o'clock, I was summoned to the office of the Vice President of Internal Audit. Marcus Thorne was a man who played golf with Douglas. I knew this because I had seen their names on the same charity tournament roster 3 years in a row. He sat behind his desk, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Close the door." "Avery," he said. I sat down. I didn't ask what this was about. I knew. "We received a call this morning," Marcus said, folding his hands over a file. "A formal concern was raised regarding your suitability for sensitive financial oversight. A concern from whom I asked, keeping my voice level. You know I cannot disclose that," he said. "But the allegation involves a pending fraud investigation regarding a private estate. Avery, you work in risk compliance. You have access to sensitive client data. If you are the subject of a civil fraud suit, that is a liability we cannot ignore." I felt the blood drain from my face. Douglas hadn't just called him to gossip. He had framed it as a professional tip-off. He was using his network to strangle my livelihood. I have not been served with any lawsuit. "Marcus," I said, "this is a personal family dispute. It has nothing to do with my performance here. Perception is risk." "Avery," he said, reciting the company motto like a scripture. "Until this is resolved, we are placing you on administrative leave, paid, for now, but your access to the server is revoked immediately." I walked out of the building 10 minutes later with a box of personal items, humiliated in front of the colleagues I had worked with for 5 years. Douglas knew exactly where to hit. He knew that without my job, I wasn't just broke. I lost my identity. I was no longer the capable professional. I was just the stepdaughter. The process server was waiting for me at my apartment building. He handed me a thick stack of papers. Sloan Kincaid and Ryan Kincaid v. The estate of Claire Whitmore and Avery Lewis. I went upstairs and called Mason. They filed for an emergency injunction. I said, staring at the legal jargon, "They are freezing the trust. It is standard," Mason said, his voice calm, though I could hear the rustling of papers on his end. "They are alleging that Claire lacked testamentary capacity when she amended the trust beneficiaries. They are claiming she was under the influence of narcotics for pain management and that you exerted undue influence. They are lying." I said, "The trust was set up in 1998. They know that." Mason said, "But they are challenging the administration of the trust, claiming the assets were diverted from marital funds fraudulently. It does not matter if it is true. Avery, it only matters that it ties the money up in court for 2 years." I looked at the list of plaintiffs. Ryan's name was right there next to Sloane's. "Ryan signed it?" I asked, feeling a fresh pang of betrayal. Mason sighed. "He is a co-plaintiff. Sloane likely told him that if he didn't sign, he was complicit in your theft. She is isolating him just as much as she is isolating you." I hung up and paced my small living room. The walls felt like they were closing in. This was their strategy. It wasn't about winning a legal argument. It was a war of attrition. They had the cash flow to pay lawyers for a decade. I had a trust fund I couldn't access and a job I had just lost. They wanted to starve me out until I begged for a settlement just to pay my rent. I looked at the stack of legal papers. They were betting on the old Avery, the Avery who kept her head down, the Avery who was grateful for scraps. But they didn't know about the promissory note. They didn't know I held the mortgage on their father's ego. I sat down at my computer, intending to draft a timeline for Mason. I needed to prove my mother's mental clarity. I needed to dig up emails, birthday cards, anything that showed she was sharp until the end. That was when the notification pinged. It was an email to my personal account. The sender was a string of random characters, a burner address. The subject line made my fingers freeze over the keyboard. "Do you think your mother was a saint?" My heart hammered against my ribs. This was part of the psychological game. Sloane or one of her minions trying to rattle me. I hovered the mouse over the delete button, but I couldn't do it. The curiosity was a physical itch. I clicked open. There was no text in the body of the email, just an attachment, a scanned PDF of an old document. I opened it. It was a bank transfer receipt from 1996, 2 years before the trust was established. It was from an account in the Cayman Islands. The amount was $200,000. The recipient was Claire Whitmore. But it was the sender's name that made the room spin. It wasn't her father. Samuel Whitmore. It wasn't a patent royalty check. The name on the account was Vargas Syndicate, LLC. I stared at the screen, the blue light stinging my eyes. I knew that name. Anyone who grew up in Providence in the 90s knew that name. It was connected to a construction scandal that had taken down a mayor and 3 city councilmen. It was dirty money. My mother was a schoolteacher. Her father was a professor. Where would she get $200,000 from a syndicate involved in organized crime laundering? I looked back at the blind trust documents Mason had given me. The patent sale story. Was it a cover? Had my mother built her entire engine of freedom on fuel that was stolen or illegal if this document was real? And if Douglas or Sloan had it, the trust wouldn't just be frozen, it would be seized by the federal government. And my mother's memory wouldn't be that of a saintly victim, but of a criminal accomplice. My phone buzzed again. Mason was calling back. I stared at it, unable to answer. The chessboard had just expanded, and I suddenly realized I didn't know all the pieces. I thought I was fighting a family drama, but looking at that receipt, I wondered if I had just stepped into a crime thriller where my mother was the villain. I looked at the email with the scandalous attachment for exactly 5 minutes. Then, I closed the laptop. The old Avery would have panicked. The old Avery would have called Mason in tears, asking if her mother was a criminal. But the Avery who had been fired or placed on leave was different. I was no longer a daughter seeking approval. I was an auditor facing a hostile audit, and I knew that in my world, data was the only currency that mattered. I did not reply to the email. Instead, I picked up the phone and hired a mercenary. Her name was Tessa Monroe. She was a forensic accountant who had a reputation for finding assets that men like Douglas Kincaid thought they had buried in the Mariana Trench. She cost $450 an hour, and I paid her retainer using the last of my personal savings. I also retained a civil investigator named Silas, a former insurance fraud detective who knew how to pull court records faster than a search engine. My second move was to Mariner Risk Analytics. I did not wait for them to fire me. I spent the night drafting a 10-page internal memorandum. I treated my own life as a case study. I outlined the timeline of the inheritance dispute, the specific threats made by Douglas's associates, and the timing of the anonymous complaint against me. I framed it not as a plea for mercy, but as a compliance alert. I sent it to the board of directors and the chief legal officer, bypassing Marcus Thorne entirely. My subject line was simple: attempted external manipulation of internal compliance procedures. I was not asking for my job back. I was putting on the record that the company was being used as a pawn in a personal extortion scheme. If they fired me now, it would look like retaliation. I had just bought myself time and unemployment benefits. Then, I went to meet Tessa. She worked out of a converted loft in the jewelry district. She was looking at the trust documents Mason had provided. Her glasses perched on the end of her nose. "You have a trust protector," Tessa said without looking up. I sat down. Mason mentioned a trustee. "No," Tessa corrected. "A trustee manages the money. A trust protector watches the trustee and the beneficiaries. It is a fail-safe. Your mother appointed a man named Julian Vane." I frowned. "I have never heard of him." "He is a retired federal judge," Tessa said. "And here's the interesting part. The trust bylaws state that if the validity of the trust is challenged in court on grounds of fraud, which is exactly what your stepsister just did, the trust protector is authorized to conduct a full-scope origin audit to defend the assets." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," Tessa said, leaning back, "that by accusing your mother of fraud, Sloan just gave this Julian Vane the legal authority to subpoena every financial interaction Douglas ever had with the trust." They opened the door. "Avery, now we get to walk through it with a search warrant." She slid a piece of paper across the desk. "But that is not the best part," she said. "I have been tracing the real estate holdings. You know about the warehouse. But look at this one." I looked at the document. It was a deed transfer for a residential property, held by a shell company called Aurora Shelters, LLC. I read the address, 142 Highland Avenue. I stopped breathing for a second. "That is the house," I said. "That is the Kincaid family home. We grew up there." "Douglas does not own it," Tessa said. a shark-like grin spreading across her face. He sold the title to this LLC in 2008 to protect it from a creditor lawsuit. He thinks Aurora Shelters is just a holding company he pays a nominal fee to. He pays rent, I asked. He pays a maintenance fee, Tessa said. But legally, he is a tenant, and Aurora Shelters is 100% owned by the Whitmore Lineage Trust. I sat back, the realization washing over me like ice water. Douglas had spent years telling me I was a guest in his house. He had told me to follow his rules under his roof, but for the last 15 years, he had been living in my house. My mother had bought the roof over his head when he was too broke to keep it, and she had never said a word. Why, I asked. Why keep it a secret? Because power is silent, Tessa said. And now, you are the landlord. I did not go to the house screaming. I did not drive over there and throw his clothes on the lawn. That was what Sloan would do. I did what a compliance officer would do. I had Mason draft a formal notice of landlord inspection. According to Rhode Island rental statutes, a landlord has the right to inspect the premises with 48 hours of notice. We sent it via certified mail and courier. 2 days later, at 9 o'clock in the morning, I pulled up to the house on Highland Avenue. I was not alone. I had a licensed building inspector with me, carrying a clipboard and a camera. Douglas's car was in the driveway. As I walked up the path, the front door flew open. Douglas was wearing a silk robe, his face a mask of fury. "What the hell is this?" "Avery," he shouted. "You are trespassing. Get off my property." I stopped at the bottom of the steps. I did not raise my voice. "Actually, Douglas," I said, holding up the deed copy, "you are the one trespassing if you deny the owner entry. I am here to inspect the structural integrity of the trust's asset." He stared at the paper. He looked at the inspector. Then he looked at me. And for the first time, I saw the fear. It wasn't the fear of homelessness. It was the fear of exposure. "You cannot come in here," he hissed, stepping forward. "I have confidential business files in my study. That is irrelevant to a structural inspection." I said, "Unless your files are load-bearing." I signaled the inspector. "We are going in." Douglas blocked the doorway. His hands were shaking. "Avery, stop. You do not know what you are doing. If you walk in there, if you start turning over rocks—" He stopped. He realized he was saying too much. I stepped closer, until I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "What are you afraid of?" "Douglas," I asked quietly, "it is just a house. Unless you have been running things out of this address that you should not be. Unless you have been claiming tax deductions on a property you do not own." His face went pale. That was it. It wasn't just the house. It was the tax fraud. If he had been depreciating this asset on his taxes while not owning it, or if he used this address for the shady transfers I saw in the Vargas email. "If I enter," I said, my voice steel, "I have a duty to report any illegal activity I see." He did not move, but he seemed to shrink. "Go away," he whispered. "Just go away, and we can talk about a settlement." I smiled. It was not a nice smile. The inspection is scheduled for 9:15. "Douglas," I checked my watch. "You have 2 minutes to move your illegal files." I turned to the inspector. "Proceed." Douglas scrambled back into the house, grabbing his phone, looking like a rat caught in a floodlight. I stood on the porch my mother had paid for, and I finally understood the game. He wasn't fighting for the money because he was greedy. He was fighting because the money was the only thing covering the holes in the floor, and I had just ripped up the carpet. The legal term for what happened next is discovery, but in practice, it felt less like exploring and more like an autopsy performed on a living patient. The court had granted a limited window for the exchange of documents. Sloan's lawyers, a high-billing team from Boston, demanded 10 years of the trust's transaction history, convinced they would find evidence that my mother had siphoned marital assets. In return, Mason demanded the financial records of every entity Douglas Kincaid controlled that had intersected with Claire Whitmore. We met in the deposition room of a neutral court reporting firm in downtown Providence. It was a sterile, windowless box with fluorescent lights that hummed like a dying insect. Douglas sat across from me, flanked by Sloan and their lead attorney. A man named Sterling who wore a watch that cost more than my annual salary. Douglas looked confident. He had spent his life bullying subordinates in rooms like this. He thought he could bully the stenographer's transcript. "Mr. Kincaid," Mason began, his voice devoid of theatricality. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table. "Exhibit A. Do you recognize this signature?" Douglas squinted at the document. It was the promissory note I had found in the yellow envelope. "It looks like my signature," Douglas said, leaning back, "but signatures can be forged. I have no recollection of this document." Mason did not blink. "So you are stating for the record, under penalty of perjury, that on October 14th, 2010, you did not receive a transfer of $1.5 million from the Whitmore Lineage Trust to Kincaid Manufacturing?" Douglas scoffed. "Absolutely not. My company was solvent. We did not need loans from my wife's imaginary money." Mason nodded and pulled out a second document. This one was a bank statement we had subpoenaed from Kincaid Manufacturing's archived ledger. "Here's the deposit record. Mr. Kincaid. Date October 14th, 2010. Amount $1.5 million. Source Archer Holdings, LLC, which, as we established, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the trust." Douglas froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. He had forgotten the name Archer Holdings. He had forgotten that for 15 years, he had been doing business with his wife under a corporate mask. I may have overseen a capital injection," Douglas stammered, shifting in his seat. "It was an intercompany transfer. A formality. A formality," Mason repeated. "And the clause pledging your voting shares as collateral. Was that also a formality?" Douglas's eyes darted to Sloane, then to Ryan. Ryan was staring at his father with a look of quiet horror. "I did not read the fine print," Douglas snapped. "Claire handled the paperwork. She told me to sign. She said it was for tax purposes. So now you admit you signed it?" Mason asked. Douglas realized the trap too late. If he denied it, he was lying about the bank transfer. If he admitted it, he was admitting the debt was real. "We will move on," Mason said, leaving Douglas sweating in the silence. During the lunch recess, I went to the breakdown room where Tessa Monroe was waiting. She had her laptop open, surrounded by a chaotic spread of spreadsheets. She looked like a hunter who had just cornered a stag. "You need to see this," Tessa said. She turned the screen toward me. It showed a flowchart of money moving in a circle. "We got access to the Kincaid Family Foundation records because Douglas used it to pay the interest on the Archer Holdings loan one time," Tessa explained. "That gave us a thread to pull. And look what unraveled." She pointed to a transaction. Douglas's manufacturing company donates $50,000 to the family foundation. Tax deductible. Perfectly legal. She traced the line to the next step. But then, the foundation awards a grant for consulting services to a company called PKL Logistics. "Who is PKL Logistics?" I asked. Tessa grinned. "There is no PKL Logistics. It is a shell. The registered address is a P.O. box in Delaware, but the bank account attached to it. It pays the credit card bill for a Mr. Douglas Kincaid." I stared at the screen. He was taking money from his company, washing it through a charity to get the tax write-off, and then funneling it back to himself to pay for his suits, his dinners, and his life. "It is embezzlement," I whispered, "and tax fraud." "It is a felony," Tessa corrected. "And here is the kicker. Look who is listed as the secretary of the foundation." I looked at the name at the bottom of the screen. Ryan Kincaid. My stomach turned. Ryan, the neutral one, the one who just wanted peace. "He does not know," I said. "Douglas makes him sign things. He puts piles of paper in front of him and says, 'Sign here for the business,' and Ryan signs because he is afraid to ask questions." Tessa shrugged. "Ignorance is not a defense in federal court. Avery, if we submit this, Ryan goes down with the ship." I walked back into the deposition room with a heavy heart. The session resumed, and Mason handed the foundation documents to Douglas. Douglas went pale. He knew exactly what this was. He looked at the paper, then he looked at me. There was no arrogance left, only panic. Ryan leaned over and looked at the document in front of his father. He saw his own signature next to a transfer for $20,000 that had gone to pay for Douglas's country club membership. Ryan looked up. "Dad, you told me this was for the inner city youth program." Douglas slammed his hand on the table. "Silence. We are not discussing this here, but the damage was done." Ryan pushed his chair back. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He stood up, looking at the man he had feared his entire life, and for the first time, he saw a criminal instead of a king. "I need a break," Ryan said. His voice was shaking, but he walked out of the room. Sloane followed him, shooting a look of pure venom at me. 10 minutes later, I was standing by the water cooler in the hallway when Sloane cornered me. She looked perfect, as always, but there was a hairline fracture in her composure. Her makeup was slightly too heavy, her eyes too wide. "How much?" she hissed. "Excuse me," I asked. "How much to drop the lawsuit and seal the record?" Sloane asked. "We will give you the trust. You can have the $30 million. Just sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the business records and the foundation." I looked at her. She was trying to buy my silence to save herself. She didn't care about the money anymore. She cared about the social status that would evaporate if her father was indicted. "You do not get it." "Sloane," I said calmly, "get what you won. Take the money and go back to your sad little apartment." "It is not about the money," I said. "It is about the fact that for 30 years, you treated me like I was lucky to eat your leftovers. You treated my mother like she was a servant, and all that time, you were living on stolen money and lies. I am not signing an NDA." "Sloane," I said. Sloane took a step back, her face twisting into something ugly. "You will regret this. We will bury you in paperwork. We will bankrupt you. You are already bankrupt," I said. "You just haven't admitted it yet." I walked back into the room. Mason was on the phone. He held up a hand to silence me. He listened for a moment, then hung up. He looked at Douglas, who was sitting alone at the table, his head in his hands. "Mr. Kincaid," Mason said. "That was Julian Vane, the trust protector." Douglas looked up. "He has reviewed the preliminary transcripts of this deposition and the exhibits regarding the Kincaid Family Foundation." Mason said, "Under the bylaws of the trust, he has determined that there is sufficient evidence of malicious financial misconduct involving trust assets." Mason paused, letting the words hang in the air. "He has activated the full audit clause, and because the irregularities involve a nonprofit foundation, he is legally obligated to forward these findings to the State Attorney General's office." Douglas made a sound that was half gasp, half sob. "The civil trial is effectively over." "Douglas," Mason said, closing his briefcase, "you are no longer fighting for an inheritance. You are fighting to stay out of prison." I looked at Douglas. The giant had fallen. He wasn't afraid of the dead anymore. He was afraid of the metal bars that were slowly, inevitably, rising around him. And the worst part for him was that the person holding the key wasn't a judge or a jury. It was the stepdaughter he had never bothered to really see. The legal term is in terrorem. It is Latin for in fear, but in the context of estate law, it is known as a no contest clause. Mason Hart dropped this particular bomb on the Monday morning following the disastrous deposition. We were back in court for the hearing on the emergency injunction, the air thick with the scent of floor wax and anxious sweat. Mason stood before the judge, a formidable woman named Justice Halloway, and addressed the courtroom with the calm demeanor of an executioner. "Your Honor," Mason said, his voice carrying to the back row where Douglas and his children sat. The late Mrs. Kincaid anticipated that her wishes might be challenged by those who felt entitled to her assets. Therefore, Article 9 of the Whitmore Lineage Trust contains a specific forfeiture provision. I saw Sloane roll her eyes. She leaned over to whisper something to her expensive lawyer, likely dismissing this as a bluff. Mason continued, "The clause states that if any beneficiary challenges the validity of the trust or its administration without probable cause, they forfeit any and all specific bequests left to them in the will." Mrs. Kincaid had left $50,000 each to Sloane and Ryan Kincaid as a gesture of goodwill. Sloane let out a short, derisive scoff. $50,000. To her, that was the price of a car. A rounding error in the lifestyle she felt she deserved. She was fighting for $30 million. She did not care about the crumbs. But Mason wasn't done. However, since the plaintiffs have filed this motion alleging fraud, a motion based on conjecture rather than evidence, and since the trust protector has already found independent evidence of misconduct on the part of the plaintiffs, we move that the clause be activated immediately. Furthermore, the trust stipulates that any forfeited funds are to be automatically transferred to the Claire Whitmore Educational Fund for underprivileged girls. Sloane's lawyer jumped up. Objection. This is a punitive interpretation. Overruled, Justice Holloway said, peering over her glasses. The language is clear, and given the report I have just reviewed from the forensic accountant, I am inclined to believe the only fraud happening here is not originating from the deceased. That was the turning point. The judge held up Tessa Monroe's report, the one detailing the circular payments, the fake logistics company, and the tax evasion through the family foundation. The request to freeze the trust assets is denied. The judge ruled, her gavel coming down with a sound that felt like a thundercrack. Furthermore, the court admits the forensic audit into evidence. The forfeiture clause is upheld. The bequests for Mr. Ryan Kincaid and Ms. Sloane Kincaid are hereby transferred to the charitable fund. Next case, it happened in seconds. The dominoes didn't just fall. They shattered. By noon, the story had leaked. The headline in the local business journal was not about Avery Lewis stealing an inheritance. It was Kincaid heirs disinherited in favor of charity amidst fraud allegations. Sloane had wanted a media war. She got one, but instead of painting me as the villain, the narrative shifted. Now, she and Ryan looked like greedy children trying to rob a scholarship fund for poor girls. The social capital she valued so highly began to evaporate. I checked my phone and saw that 3 board members of a charity Sloane chaired had already resigned. Douglas cornered me in the courthouse lobby. He looked older than he had an hour ago. The confident tycoon was gone, replaced by a man watching the water rise around his ankles. "Avery," he said, his voice low and urgent, "we need to stop this." I stopped walking and looked at him. There is no we. Douglas, there is just you, the tenant, and me, the landlord. Please, he said, and the desperation in his eyes was real. He reached out as if to touch my arm, then pulled back. I am willing to apologize. I will issue a statement saying there was a misunderstanding. I will acknowledge you as a rightful heir. Just tell your lawyer to seal the audit. Tell him to withdraw the submission to the Attorney General. I looked at this man who had spent 20 years making me feel small. He thought a public apology was a currency I still valued. He thought I still wanted his approval. I do not want your apology. Douglas, I said coldly, here are my terms. You will withdraw the lawsuit with prejudice, meaning you can never file it again. You will sign a sworn affidavit admitting to the debt you owe the trust, and you will personally call the CEO of Mariner Risk Analytics and retract the false complaint you made against me. You will tell them you lied. He stared at me, his jaw working. If I admit I lied, I could be liable for defamation. That is a risk calculation you should have made before you tried to destroy my career. I said, you have 24 hours. I walked away, leaving him standing there. I felt a strange lack of satisfaction. It wasn't joy. It was just the grim efficiency of balancing a ledger. That evening, I received a text message. It wasn't from Douglas or Sloane. It was from Ryan. Meet me at the boat ramp on East Ferry. Alone. Please. My investigator. Silas. Told me not to go. He said it was a trap. But I knew Ryan. Ryan wasn't a trap setter. He was the one who got caught in them. I drove to the waterfront. The fog was rolling in off the bay, obscuring the lights of the Newport Bridge. Ryan was sitting on a bench, staring at the dark water. He was wearing a hoodie, looking like a teenager again, not the 30-year-old vice president of a company. I sat down on the other end of the bench. I kept my hand on the pepper spray in my pocket, just in case. Did Sloane send you? I asked. Ryan shook his head. He didn't look at me. Sloane thinks she can still win. She is delusional. She thinks if she screams loud enough, the judge will change her mind. Then why are you here? I asked. Ryan turned to me. His face was ravaged by stress. There were dark circles under his eyes that looked like bruises. I need you to know something. Avery, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't know about the shell companies. I swear. Dad just put papers in front of me. He said, sign this. It's for the tax abatement. Sign this. It's for the insurance. I never read them. I sighed. Ryan, I know. But that doesn't save you. You are an officer of the company. Negligence is not a shield. It gets worse, he whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He handed it to me. It was a bank document from 3 years ago. A commercial line of credit for $4 million, taken out by Kincaid Manufacturing. I scanned the bottom. There was Douglas's signature, and right next to it was Ryan's. I looked closer at the terms. It wasn't just a signature as a witness. It was a personal guarantee. Oh, Ryan. I breathed out. He made me sign it, Ryan said, tears spilling onto his cheeks. He said the company was having a cash flow issue and the bank needed a second guarantor because his credit was leveraged. He said it was just a formality. He said he would refinance it in 6 months and take my name off. He never took it off. I stated, it wasn't a question. Ryan shook his head. If the company goes under if you call in the debt from the trust and push Kincaid Manufacturing into insolvency, the bank will come after me. They will take my house. They will take my savings. They will take everything I have. He looked at me, pleading. I am not like Sloan. Avery, I never wanted to hurt you. I was just trying to keep the peace, but if you destroy him, you destroy me too. I looked at the document, then at the water. I realized suddenly that the fear my mother had written about wasn't just Douglas's fear of being poor. It was his fear of being exposed as a parasite who fed on his own children. He had used my mother's money to prop up his business, and when that wasn't enough, he had used his son's future as collateral. Sloan was the golden child, protected and spoiled. I was the scapegoat, ignored and excluded. But Ryan was the utility. He was the tool Douglas used when he ran out of other options. In a way, Ryan had it worse than me. I had been neglected, but I was free. Ryan had been included, and it had cost him his soul. I folded the paper and handed it back to him. This isn't just about inheritance anymore, is it? I asked softly. No, Ryan said, wiping his face. It is a hostage situation. I stood up. The wind was cold, biting through my jacket. Go home. Ryan, I said, don't tell Sloan we met. Don't tell Douglas. What are you going to do? He asked, looking up at me like I was the only life raft in the ocean. I am going to finish this, I said, but I am not going to let him drag you down with him. My mother left a letter for you too. Ryan's eyes widened. She did. I didn't have it on me. It was back in my apartment, in the safe. The second letter Mason had mentioned but hadn't given me until the audit confirmed Ryan's involvement. I will bring it to you tomorrow, I said, but you have to be ready to do something difficult. You have to stop being the son who signs papers. You have to become the witness who reads them. I walked back to my car, leaving him by the water. My anger at Ryan had evaporated, replaced by a cold resolve. Douglas Kincaid wasn't just a fraudster. He was a cannibal. He ate the people who loved him to sustain his own image. I wasn't just fighting to keep my money. I was fighting to dismantle a system of control that had trapped us all. And for the first time, I realized that saving myself might mean I had to save Ryan too. Not because he deserved it, but because it was the one thing Douglas would never expect me to do. The evening before the trial was not filled with the frantic energy of preparation, but with a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the kind of quiet that settles over a city before a hurricane makes landfall. I was sitting on my living room floor, surrounded not by legal briefs, but by the ghosts of my mother's life. Earlier that afternoon, a courier from the Trust Protector, Julian Vane, had delivered a sealed box. It contained the raw data of Claire Whitmore's existence, her personal journals. These were not diaries filled with poetry or dreams. They were logbooks. My mother, the woman who I thought spent her days gardening and reading novels, had kept a meticulous record of every single time Douglas Kincaid had used her. I opened a leather-bound notebook dated 2005. Her handwriting was small and precise. March 3rd. Douglas asked me to sign a joint tax filing. He covered the second page with his hand, claiming the ink was wet. I signed. Later, I checked the printer cache. He is claiming a deduction for a charitable donation to a shell company in Nevis. I have logged the transaction number. August 12th. Douglas came home angry. He needed a signature for a refinancing application on the lake house. He said if I did not sign, we would lose the summer property. I signed. I know the money is not going to the mortgage. It is going to cover the margin call on his personal trading account. I read page after page. For 20 years. She had documented his coercion. She had noted every time he manipulated her compliance. Every time he used her silence as a stamp of approval for his fraud. She hadn't been a victim. She had been a witness building a case file. One entry at a time. Waiting for a prosecutor who would only arrive after she was gone. But at the bottom of the box, there was something else. A white envelope, identical to the one I had received. But the name on the front was not mine. It was addressed to Ryan Kincaid. I stared at it. My mother had predicted this. She knew the family architecture better than anyone. She knew that when the walls started crumbling, Sloane would claw her way to the top of the rubble, but Ryan would be trapped underneath it. I texted Ryan, "I have something that belongs to you. Meet me at the coffee shop on Thayer Street. 10 minutes. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth, looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. He jumped when I slid into the seat across from him. "Is it a settlement offer?" he asked, his voice thick with hope. "No," I said. I placed the envelope on the table. "It is a letter from my mother." Ryan stared at it. He looked terrified to touch it. "She wrote this years ago," I said softly. "She left it with the trust protector, with instructions to release it only if the family was at war. She knew you would be caught in the middle." Ryan's hand shook as he picked up the envelope. He tore it open. I watched his eyes scan the page, watched the color drain from his face, and then watched the tears start to fall. Silent and fast. "Read it to me," I said. Ryan took a breath, his voice trembling. "My dear Ryan, I am writing this because I know your father. I know that by the time you read this, he will have put you in a position where you feel you have to choose between your loyalty to him and your own integrity. I want you to know that I never blamed you for your silence. I know how hard it is to speak when you are raised in a house where love is conditional on obedience." Ryan stopped, choking back a sob. He wiped his eyes and continued. "But silence is a debt, Ryan, and eventually, it comes due. I have left Avery the means to break the cycle. But I want to leave you a way out. You are not your father. You do not have to be his collateral. If you are reading this, it means you are scared. Don't be. Use the truth. It is the only currency he cannot counterfeit. I did not choose sides between you and Avery. I chose a future where at least one of you gets to be free. I hope it is both." Ryan put the letter down. He put his head in his hands. "She knew," he whispered. "She knew he would use me. She knew about the guarantee before I even signed it. She saw everything." "Ryan," I said, "and she didn't hate you for it. She pitied you." Suddenly, a shadow fell over our table. I looked up to see Sloane standing there. She was wearing a trench coat, her face a mask of cold fury. She was holding her phone, the screen displaying a location tracking app. "I knew it," she hissed. "I knew you were weak. Ryan." "Sloane," Ryan said, scrambling to hide the letter. "It is not what you think. It is exactly what I think," she spat. "You are conspiring with the enemy the night before the trial. Do you have any idea what this looks like? If Dad finds out—" "Call him," I interrupted. Sloane whipped her head toward me. "What, call him?" I repeated, leaning back. "Put him on speaker. Tell him his son is having a breakdown because he is terrified of going to prison for the bank fraud Douglas committed. See what he says. See if he asks if Ryan is okay, Or if he asks about the liability exposure. Sloane's eyes narrowed. She pulled out her phone and dialed. It rang twice. Sloane Douglas's voice filled the small space between us. "Where are you? The lawyers are here. I found Ryan," Sloane said, glaring at me. "He is with Avery." There was a pause. A cold, calculating silence. "What did he say to her?" Douglas asked. Not, "Is he okay?" Not, "Bring him home." What did he say? "Has he compromised the defense strategy?" "He is crying." "Dad," Sloane said, her voice wavering slightly as she realized I was right. "He is scared about the guarantee. Tell him to shut his mouth." Douglas snapped. "Tell him if he talks to her. He is cut off. I will not have a traitor in this family. If he wobbles. Sloane, you cut him loose. We protect the estate first." The call ended. Ryan sat frozen. The confirmation was brutal and absolute. To his father. He was not a son. He was a leak to be plugged. Sloane looked at her phone, then at Ryan. For a second, just a second, I saw hesitation in her eyes, but then the armor slammed back down. She was her father's daughter. "You heard him, Ryan?" she said coldly. "Get up. We are leaving." Ryan looked at her. Then he looked at the letter from my mother, the woman who had no obligation to love him, but who had offered him redemption from the grave. "No," Ryan said. Sloane looked stunned. "Excuse me, I am not going with you," Ryan said. His voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "I am done being the collateral." Sloane sneered. "Fine, rot with her. You will be penniless by noon tomorrow." She turned on her heel and stormed out of the coffee shop. I looked at Ryan. "You know what you have to do," I said. "I can't testify against him." "Avery," Ryan said, panic rising again. "I signed the papers. I am liable." I leaned forward. "Here's the deal. Ryan, you testify. You take the stand, and you tell the truth about the guarantee, the coercion, and the fake charity grants. You admit your part in it." He shook his head. "I will go to jail." "No, you won't," I said, "because if you testify truthfully, I will instruct the trust protector to use the trust's resources to settle your personal liability with the bank. I will pay off the $4 million guarantee." Ryan stared at me. "You would do that?" "That is a fortune." Why I tapped the letter on the table. "Because she wanted a future where one of us was free," I said. "I am already free. Ryan, I am buying your freedom now. But the price is the truth." Ryan closed his eyes and nodded. "I will do it." I went home and sat at my desk. The city lights outside were blurring in the rain. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I needed to write my opening statement, not for the lawyer, but for myself. An affidavit of intent. I, Avery Lewis, do not seek this inheritance for the sake of accumulation. I seek it as restitution. For 30 years, I was told I was a guest in my own life. I was told my value was zero. Tomorrow, I am not asking the court for money. I am asking the court to validate that I exist. I am asking for the right to be more than a footnote in the Kincaid ledger. I signed it. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Mason. "Get some sleep. I just spoke to Tessa. We found the final document in the deepest archive of the trust. It is the one your mother hinted at in the first letter." I texted back, "Is it bad?" Mason's reply appeared 3 seconds later. "It is not bad. It is catastrophic. Douglas will try to act the grieving widower tomorrow. But once we put this document on the screen, he won't be able to act at all. It is the checkmate." I turned off the phone. I walked to the window and looked out at the dark skyline of Providence. Somewhere out there, Douglas Kincaid was probably drinking scotch and rehearsing his lies. He thought he was fighting a stepdaughter. He didn't realize he was fighting a ghost who had spent 20 years preparing for this exact moment. Tomorrow, the haunting would end. Tomorrow, the eviction would begin. The final hearing took place on a rainy Wednesday morning. The courtroom was not packed with spectators, but the air was heavy with the static electricity of a storm about to break. Justice Holloway sat on the bench, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the mountain of motions filed over the last 48 hours. Douglas Kincaid took the stand first. He wore a navy suit that was perfectly pressed, but I noticed his tie was slightly crooked, a small imperfection that betrayed his internal chaos. He stuck to the script he had written in his head decades ago. "She is not my blood," Douglas said, pointing a finger at me. His voice was steady, practiced. "Avery Lewis has no claim to the Kincaid estate. She is the daughter of another man. I allowed her to live in my house out of charity. Now, she is trying to rob my legitimate children of their birthright." Sloane sat in the front row, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the disinherited orphan to perfection. She nodded along with every word, casting mournful glances at the judge. But the courtroom is not a theater. It is a place where paper beats performance. Mason Hart stood up. He did not raise his voice. He walked to the center of the room and placed a single document on the projector. It was not the trust deed. It was not the forensic audit. It was a contract dated November 12th, 2008. "Mr. Kincaid," Mason said, "you testified that you supported Avery Lewis out of charity. Is that correct?" "Yes," Douglas said. "I paid for her food. I paid for her heating." Mason pointed to the screen. "This document suggests otherwise. This is a liquidity injection agreement between yourself and the Whitmore Lineage Trust. It details a transfer of $800,000 to your personal accounts during the financial crash of 2008. Douglas stiffened. "I needed a bridge loan." "It was not a loan." Mason corrected him. "It was a conditional grant. And here's the condition." Mason zoomed in on paragraph 4. The text was clear, typed in standard black font, signed by Douglas Kincaid in blue ink. "In exchange for this capital injection to prevent personal bankruptcy, Douglas Kincaid agrees to irrevocably waive any claim to control the life, finances, or future assets of Avery Lewis. Furthermore, the signatory agrees that any future attempt to disparage, disinherit, or legally obstruct Avery Lewis will constitute a breach of contract, triggering an immediate penalty clause of $5 million, payable to the trust." The room went silent. My mother hadn't just saved him from bankruptcy. She had bought my freedom. She had paid him $800,000 to ensure that he could never legally touch me. "And you breached that contract," Mason said, his voice hard. "You breached it the moment you stood up in the reading of the will and called her an outsider. You breached it when you filed this lawsuit. You breached it today on the stand." Douglas looked at the screen. He looked at the signature. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The narrative of the benevolent stepfather had just been shredded. He wasn't a guardian. He was a paid contractor who had violated his service agreement. Justice Holloway leaned forward. "Mr. Kincaid," the judge said, "it appears you have not only wasted this court's time with a frivolous lawsuit, but you have also triggered a penalty that exceeds your current liquid assets." Then, she turned to the defense table where I sat. "But there is more, isn't there?" Mr. Hart Mason nodded. "Your Honor, regarding the cross-claim for fraud, we are prepared to submit the full forensic audit of the Kincaid Family Foundation and the tax records regarding the sham logistics company to the District Attorney's Office for criminal review. Unless, of course, a settlement is reached today. It was the checkmate." Douglas looked at Sloane. She was staring at the floor, realizing that her inheritance was gone and her social standing was about to follow. Then he looked at Ryan. Ryan stood up. He walked to the front of the court, past his father, and stood next to Mason. "I have a statement, Your Honor," Ryan said. His voice shook, but he did not stutter. "I wish to testify that my signature on the $4 million bank guarantee for Kincaid Manufacturing was obtained under duress. I was not informed of the risk, and I was pressured by my father, Douglas Kincaid, to sign as a condition of my employment." Douglas slammed his hand on the railing. "Ryan, you ungrateful coward! Sit down!" "Mr. Kincaid," the bailiff shouted. Ryan did not flinch. He looked at me, and I nodded. Justice Holloway looked at the broken family before her. She looked at Douglas, red-faced and defeated. She looked at Sloane, frozen in shock, and she looked at Ryan, who had finally stepped out of the shadow. "The court accepts the testimony," the judge ruled. 10 minutes later, it was over. Douglas signed. He had no choice. The settlement was brutal in its simplicity. He withdrew all claims against the trust. He admitted the debt. He agreed to vacate the house on Highland Avenue within 30 days so the trust could sell it. And most importantly, he signed a confession regarding the bank guarantee, absolving Ryan of the liability and assuming the full debt himself, a debt he would have to liquidate his remaining business assets to pay. We walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. The rain had stopped. The pavement was steaming. Sloan walked past me without a word, getting into a taxi alone. Douglas did not come out the front. He slipped out a side exit to avoid the press. Ryan stood on the steps, looking at the city. "You really did it," he said. "You paid off the bank. The trust paid off the bank." I corrected him. It was a bad investment, financially speaking, but my mother liked long odds. Ryan smiled. A weak, tired smile. "I am going to move to Vermont," he said. "I have a friend who runs a carpentry shop. I think I am done with finance. Good luck." "Ryan," I said. He walked away. A man with empty pockets but a light step. I got into my car and drove to my office at Mariner Risk Analytics. I walked past the receptionist who had avoided my eyes a week ago. I walked into the CEO's office. He had already received the legal notice retracting Douglas's complaint. "I am not here to ask for my job back." I said to him, "I am here to resign." I did not need the job anymore, but more importantly, I did not need the validation. I spent the next month setting up the Claire Whitmore Foundation. We endowed a scholarship for women entering forensic accounting and risk management. We paid off the mortgage on my small apartment. I sold the Kincaid family home to a nice young couple who had no idea about the wars fought in the dining room on my last day in the city, before taking a long trip to see the places my mother had only read about in books. I sat at my desk in my apartment. I opened the drawer and took out her letter. The ink was starting to fade, but the words were burned into my mind. She had played a 20-year game of chess so that I could win in a single afternoon. She had hidden her strength so I could find mine. I placed the letter back in the drawer and locked it. I looked out the window at the skyline of Providence, the river glittering in the distance. I wasn't the stepdaughter. I wasn't the outsider. I wasn't the other. I touched the glass, feeling the cool surface against my fingertips. "I am here," I said aloud to the empty room. "I am legitimate, in the truest sense of my own life. Thank you so much for listening to this story of justice and redemption. I would love to hear from you. Please comment down below and tell me where you are listening from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed Avery's journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Juliet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to me.